Hello, my name is Buki Fatona. I am a doctoral researcher at the University of Oxford. Welcome to Phil-Sci-Theo, an 8-part discussion series on topics in the intersect of philosophy of science and religion. In your book, Science and Truthfulness of Beauty, you recognize different kinds of beauty. Of particular interest to me, and hopefully to the listeners, is your concept of truthful beauty. What is truthful beauty, and how is it different from other kinds of beauty?
So I think truthful beauty for me is, and can I just say first of all that I chose the word truthful quite carefully because it seems to me that, because of course I acknowledge the contingency of the truths that science discovers. I'm a realist, but I'm a realist with questions. So of course scientists provide a contingent understanding of how things are. So rather than talk about truths, I talk about things that are truthful, because by saying that I'm alerting to the fact I know that they may not be true all the way down, but they provide truthful, true enough statements at a particular level or a particular way we can understand for now. And when I talk about truthful beauty, I'm talking about experiences of beauty we have that convey to us things which are truthful. So what I mean by that is, if I am studying a molecular structure and I have the insight through studying that molecular structure, I enjoy it, I find it inherently beautiful. That's one of the reasons why I study in the first place. I discover things about it which are maybe unexpected, or which are further insights which I consider to be beautiful insights into how it works. And where it's truthful is where that process conveys to me understandings about how this molecule works in a kind of mechanical way, or by a mechanical analogy. But I think truthful beauty is something that we can find operating at all levels scientifically, but also within just ordinary human exchange. So in terms of other examples of scientific activity, I think a neat, an attractive, a beautifully designed experiment, which is a bit like a game actually, that a beautifully designed experiment is something which can then convey us truth by giving us data which are useful data, well founded data. And a truthful or beautiful hypothesis can convey truth to us. It's a neat, it's a beautiful thing. We find it attractive as an idea about how these various bits of information we have access to might fit together into a coherent whole. And it's a truthful beauty when actually that enables us to see further than the hypothesis initially imagined, as it were, or we imagined through the hypothesis. It allows us to posit new ideas which we can then test. So it's a kind of conveyance towards new understanding. And when I say it's something which is relevant to ordinary human exchange, I think that seeing some beautiful aspect to another person's personality allows you to see more deeply into the truth of who they are. And quite often in pastoral ministry, that can be around perceiving someone's neediness or their own insecurities. And that can be a real route towards seeing something more beautiful about their personality, but it's also something very truthful about who they are. I referred earlier to a piece of art that one person might think tasteless and another person might think beautiful, and something that they desire to have for themselves because it gladdens them to have it, or that they might think it wonderful in their own way. And I think that to understand why somebody might think that is an experience of truthful beauty. To see, as it were, through the other person's eyes is a way of truthfully understanding beauty more deeply and understanding them as people more profoundly.
Up until now, we've spoken about beauty and truth. I wonder if there is another side to that. Is there a usefulness in that which is the opposite of beautiful? So is there a way, you spoke about truthfulness, the search for truthfulness as a game. So maybe that which isn't beautiful in that game plays the purpose of redirecting you in another direction.
Well, so certainly yes. I mean, if something just doesn't fit within so you develop a coherent model, what you think is a coherent, neat model, and then something just does not fit, then actually the model loses. It really, in a sense, ought to lose its beauty for you, but it loses some key aspect of its beauty. So yes, I mean, again, in the same way that you might think a person to be attractive, but then when you see them do something ugly, that attractiveness becomes harder to see, and it may well be something that then just passes you by.
Yes.
So, so the shadow side works certainly in the sense that if there's something not beautiful, something incoherent in a particular model, say, or provided by data which don't fit, then actually you need to then, that is an experience potentially guiding you more closely towards the truth, yeah. Of course, it's also possible for the perception of beauty to mislead you. So for you to have a beautiful idea which you think is terribly neat, but it turns out doesn't fit with the data, and that is something, then an idea you need to be abandoning. And again, it should be an idea which loses its luster, as it were, as an experience of beauty. It loses something important. It may still have a kind of internal coherence, but it doesn't fit with the data, and so the wonder that you saw in it should be lost, I think. I will also say that, things which are kind of have broken symmetry or broken beauty do have a kind of beauty of their own.
Yes.
Famously, a particular mark on animal hide, particular cultures might be a particularly attractive, beautiful thing, or a crack in a piece of porcelain in another culture might be a particularly attractive thing that you might plug with a bit of gold just to highlight it, and so on. So the point is that breakage in beauty can have its own attractiveness, or breakage in what otherwise might seem too perfect can have its own attractiveness. But it's also within science a real corrective towards a more accurate understanding, hopefully.
Yes. It's a good point about breakage having its own attractiveness, because I immediately thought about the woundedness of Jesus Christ on the cross. I guess Christians would say that that is ultimate beauty, and yet it is a marred visage that we have that expresses beauty to us.
Yes, that's a very interesting point, and the beauty we see there is the beauty of God's love in Christ for us, and that the way the world is required that wounding for that beauty to be expressed in the way that it had to be expressed. It couldn't have been expressed in another way.
Yeah, thank you. In epistemology, the philosophical study of knowledge, knowledge is usually said to comprise justified true belief. However, what justification consists in varies across different epistemic accounts. Is there a difference between justification of true beliefs in science versus in religion?
So clearly there are some differences, but I think, similar to what I said before, I think that those differences may not be as fundamental as might initially be thought. So clearly one of the key bases for justification in science is reproducibility, experimental replication, showing the same data again and again, statistical analysis that proves that within a certain margin of error, such and such a measure is correct, accurate. And obviously in religious practice, in faith, in spiritual exercises, we are not seeking to demonstrate in that kind of objective way. Having said that, I think that there are some similarities in scientific practice, and if we take the example of prayer, for example. So in scientific practice, we learn from what people have done before. As Newton says, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. We can see farther as a result. We have learned alongside others. We're part of a practicing community in which we do things collectively, and it may be that we need to work as a team in order to do what we need to do. We gain new insights or new experiences, and we build on those, and then basically it goes back into the whole process again. If you think about prayer, it's obviously part of a community. It's something in which we learn from those who have gone before us, who have taught us how to pray. We are part of a community of people who stretch throughout time as well as through space. We collectively experiencing, worshipping together, praying together, having a spiritual exercise together. What we're doing is that we can then reflect together on what we've experienced. We can talk about the insights we gain. We gain new insights for ourselves. and then we feed it all back in. So although the processes are clearly different, and we're not stepping out to test things in religion, that's the fundamental difference. We're not setting out, after all, Christ warned us not to go around trying to test God, and he wasn't keen on demonstrating, he wasn't keen on he didn't use signs in order to show that, that he didn't use signs as ways of demonstrating his power. They were signs which alerted people to the presence of God in the world. That's a different thing, one might suggest. But anyway, but the point is that certainly we're not in the business in religious practice of demonstrating such and such to be the case by repetition. Yes. Nevertheless, the basis on which justification in practice is found in religious exercises, I think, is not as different from how it is found in scientific activity as people might assume, because it does involve repetition. It's just that they are things we find in a community to be warranted, useful processes, experiences, practices, shared by both. And I suppose that shouldn't be terribly surprising, because humans are doing both of them.
In one of your sermons, you mention or you state that God can't be represented, only known. Augustine of Hippo, the 4th century North African Roman bishop, said something similar. For Augustine, the concept of God lacks an image or imagery. Nonetheless, God is known and remembered in his interior world, wherein the soul resides. God's lack of imagery or representation raises a question. How can something which lacks representation be known or be knowable?
So, the way I'd approach that is to say that for human beings, the experience of God is not... I don't believe the experience that God is representable in any trivial way. We can, of course, use language, which ultimately then breaks down when we push it to its limits to try and talk about God, what properties God might have or not have. But the point is that clearly representation breaks down ultimately when you're trying to talk about a God of whom classically we would say we can know nothing except what Christ has shown us. Now, I'm not sure that's I don't think we need to go that far necessarily, because clearly there are experiences of the human soul which might help us to understand what God is like. However, I think for a Christian you might say that too is something which is of a difference of the experience of Christ, because it's the presence of God's image in us which is enabling us to perceive what God might be saying to us, or God's presence with us. What I think is very interesting and worth reflecting on here is the ways in which human beings respond to what they later perceive to be an experience of God. So what I mean by this is that, in a sense, God isn't represented by us, but we experience God represented to us by one another and in our collective experiences. So we're not obviously painting a picture of God, but we are understanding something of what God can say to us and an experience of God's presence with us when we worship, in whatever tradition we have. In the Christian church, it's very likely to involve forms of singing. It will involve forms of prayer. It will involve some common prayers which are said by all Christians, such as the Lord's Prayer. It has core experiences which, through collective participation, enable us not so much to represent, or not to represent God directly in the way that one might represent a molecule, but to understand God as represented to us by one another in our community experience. I have found it very powerful to explore, as so many others have, how in God there is no difference between essence and act, between what God is being and what God is doing, how in God there is a simultaneous process, that God is not so much a noun as verbal and so on, the different ways it's been expressed. And that is a very, very rich scene which many writers and thinkers from many Christian traditions follow, but it's not only something that we can follow in our reading, in our own thinking. It's also something we can follow in our own practice, because there's a sense in which we become individuals when we are truly worshipping, in which the difference between our existence and our actions are reduced, and in the ideal case to essentially nothing, that we do become who we are through worship and in other ways. Which is why, of course, religious experience is not limited to explicitly religious activity, or experience of God is not limited to explicitly religious activity. Any form of ecstatic engagement with truth is, I think, an engagement with something that is really informed by God's wisdom. The insights that we gain into the world are insights which the Holy Spirit is helping us to see. And so, and they are also ecstatic experiences. So I think the point in time when we gain new insights are moments when we are forgetful of who we are and simply become the process in which we are engaged. This is very well known popularly through some aspects of mindfulness activity, mindfulness practice, but also, for example, through the concept of flow. Personally, I would take flow to be very essentially identical, in fact, to the experiences that we have when we are engaged ecstatically in the study of something scientifically, but also when we're engaged ecstatically in worship together. And I think it's the pointed time in which human beings become most who they are meant to be, who they are. Just like, a composer is most themselves when they're not thinking about writing music, but just writing music, or a mother is most themselves when they're just engaged with their child. They're not thinking about it, they're just doing it. A doctor is most the person they're supposed to be when they're just engaged in their treatment. Scientists is most themselves when they're just doing what they need to do. And so on. I think we are, each of us, all of us, most ourselves when we're just engaged as the people we are in what we are engaged with and not thinking about what we're doing. And that is when we're most alive, that is when we're most ourselves, and that is when we most closely image God.